Saxons, this is Ms. Masters, and today is First Chapter Friday. I'm reading this month from Holiday Books and Stories. Tonight I'm reading a Hanukkah story, because it's the second night of Hanukkah, from an anthology of holiday stories called My True Love Gave to Me. It's available in our library in book and electronic form, I think. This story is by Gayle Foreman. She wrote If I Stay and Where She Went, and it's called What the Hell Have You Done, Sophie Roth? In the 15 weeks since starting her freshman year at the University of Bumfuckville, Sophie had counted at least a dozen "What the hell have you done, Sophie Roth?" moments. The first was when Sophie's mother dropped her off at the dorms, which were covered in brick and ivy just like the catalog promised. The rental car's engine had not yet stopped ticking when Sophie understood that the idea of a college in the country, in the middle of the country, pastoral was how she'd been describing it to friends back in Brooklyn, wasn't so much pastoral as it was foreign, as if she decided to enroll at the University of Beirut. Attendant sinking feelings in the stomach soon followed the revelation that really shouldn't have been a revelation. It was so obvious. It had been obvious to all her friends, who were perplexed by her choice to go here, and to her mother, who wasn't. As she and her mother hauled her suitcases into the dorm, Sophie didn't dare let her feelings show. It would only make her mother feel guilty. The University of Bumfuckville being pastoral wasn't the real reason Sophie had enrolled. The second "What the hell have you done, Sophie Roth?" moment had come later that weekend when she'd met her roommates. Nice girls, pretty girls, welcoming girls. But that first night together, beer and pizza with crusts thick as the length of Sophie's thumb, Sophie had had to say, "I'm kidding," at least half a dozen times, a trend that continued well into the term until Sophie finally realized that sarcasm was like a separate dialect, one not universally understood. "You're so big city," one of the Caitlins, there were 3 on her hall, would say. Sophie was never quite sure if this was an insult. Sophie had imagined she would be the mysterious one on campus. She was from the big city after all. But it was the girls from the small Midwestern towns who had dreamed of going to college here all their lives, whose parents had gone here, who were inscrutable. The guys were no better, strapping in big-toothed specimens with names like Kyle and Connor. At the start of term, one such guy had asked Sophie out on what she thought was a date, but what had turned out to be a group outing to play ultimate frisbee. Sophie had been grouchy about it, but then to her surprise had gotten into the game, catching a scoring pass, talking smack against the other team. On the walk back to the dorms, Kyle/Connor had said, "You're really competitive, aren't you?" Sophie had no doubt as to whether that was an insult. That was "What the hell have you done, Sophie Roth?" moment number 4. Or maybe it was 5? There had been several with the boys here. She was starting to lose count. She'd long since lost hope. She had no one to blame for tonight's "What the hell have you done" moment except herself. Finals had ended 2 days ago, and most of the students had decamped for winter break. Flight prices back to New York halved if Sophie left the following week, so she had to stick around and twiddle thumbs. Earlier that day, Sophie had been selling her books back to the bookstore, getting a pittance in return, because 2 editions were about to be updated, the clerk explained, causing Sophie to get into an argument with the poor sap about why all textbooks should be digital and updated automatically. Only it wasn't really an argument because the clerk wanted nothing to do with the debate. On the way out, she'd seen a flyer for caroling on the quad that night, and for some reason she'd thought, "This seems like a good idea." Sophie wondered when she was going to learn that lots of things seem like a good idea, but a small amount of analysis might uncover that such seemingly good ideas are, in fact, intrinsically faulty. Take communism. Seem like a good idea. Everyone shares, no one goes hungry. But maybe give it a good think, and you'd come away understanding for it to work, you need an inhuman capacity for cooperation, or a much more human capacity for totalitarianism. Anyways, she'd heard Luba describe breadlines and bugged phones and Siberian gulags, enough to know which way that went. A caroling concert? She really should have known better. The entire point of a caroling concert was to join in. First of all, Sophie was Jewish. It was bad enough that she'd basically skipped Hanukkah this year, but to spend the last night of the Jewish holiday serenading the birth of Jesus? Just no. And even if they were to throw in, I have a little dreidel, they wouldn't. Dreidels were as foreign to Bumfuckville as moon rocks. Sophie wouldn't sing. Not in public. Not here. In her defense, she did like Christmas carols. Not the horrible dirges sung over mall speakers, but people singing in pretty harmonies. Sophie remembered when she first heard carolers wandering the streets outside her apartment in Brooklyn. They had harmonized so beautifully, Sophie had asked her grandmother if those were angels singing. No, darling, Luba had replied. Just Gentiles. There was nothing wrong with the singing tonight. It was fine, but not remotely magical or angelic. And everyone seemed to be wearing Christmas sweaters, like with appliques of Rudolph or Santa. One girl even had a sweater with a tree that actually lit up. If Sophie had gone to NYU, such sweaters would have been worn ironically. But here, they weren't. Everything was so goddamn sincere, including the carols. Not that she expected ironic Christmas carols. Jingle bells, Batman smells, Robin laid an egg. Wasn't that how they'd sang it in elementary school? But there was so much eye shining and heart as they paruppa-pum-pummed about little drummer boys, plus the sweaters. She couldn't take it anymore. Oh, the Ned Flanders of it all, she muttered to herself, which was something she'd been doing a lot lately. When she admitted this to Zora, her friend had warned that it was a certain step on the road to crazy cat ladyism. Sophie had laughed, but when she thought of her mother, alone in the apartment with only her sculptures, and now Luba's cats for company, it didn't seem quite so funny. Yo, you just say something about Ned Flanders? Caught cat ladying out loud? Oi. Sophie felt as though she'd been spotted streaking the quad naked. She pretended she had not heard the question. You did. You said the Ned Flanders something something something. She turned around. Standing about 3 feet away was one of the black guys on campus. Sophie hated herself for thinking of him like that. She'd grown up on the bed-stewy side of Clinton Hill, after all. But here, it was hard not to. There seemed to be like 20 black students at the entire college, a lot of them scholarship students like her. She knew this because she'd met quite a few at that dean's reception for excellence the first week of school. She'd been flattered by the invite until she walked in and was given a handout with still open work-study slots, and understood that it was a get-together for the scholarship students. She'd hid out in a corner, eavesdropping on a bunch of guys from the basketball team. Basketball was huge here, she'd been surprised to learn, comparing notes about some of the sillier comments they'd gotten in their first week. Sophie had been dying to chime in with some choice examples of her own, but she stopped herself. Though she may have felt like a minority here, she was still white. She tried to remember if this guy had been at the reception. He was looking at her like he might know her. I didn't say it so much as mutter it, she said, or rather muttered. He laughed, a big open-chested laugh. And for a second, Sophie felt the tiny thrill of landing a successful joke. But it was followed by doubt, because people here didn't get her humor. When she made people laugh, she suspected it was after she'd left the room, which annoyed the shit out of her. Back home, people at least had the decency to laugh in your face. This caroling thing was a supremely bad idea. She turned to walk away. She felt a hand, a huge hand on her shoulder. Sorry, I'm not messing with you. For real. I was thinking the same thing. She turned around. You were thinking about Ned Flanders? She waited for him to say, diddly-o, or some such. It would be exactly what the Kyles or Connors would say. Then they'd ask her major. But he just smiled, a slow, oozy grin, too hot for this cold night. Yeah, Ned Flanders, he said, among others. He made it sound risque, the among others, and Sophie felt herself flush. He stuck out a hand sheathed in a fingerless glove. "Russell," he said. She looked at him, or rather up at him. He was very tall, a whole foot taller than Sophie at least, and Sophie was 5'5". Tall enough to play basketball. Maybe he was on scholarship, same as her. The thought was reassuring as his grip, which was firm, not crushing. He wasn't one of those guys who had to break your hand to prove just how much they treated you as equals. "Sophie," she said. "So, Sophie." He opened his arms wide. "What brings you here?" It felt like a variation of the "what's your major" query, the implication really being, "What are you doing here?" Sophie hated being asked her major. She didn't have one. She was a first-term freshman, for Christ's sake. Not everyone had their lives figured out by the time they exited the womb. As for what she was doing here, a year ago she hadn't even heard of this place. Her high school guidance counselor suggested it, apparently knowing the ins and outs of obscure colleges with ridiculous endowments. When the school made a financial aid offer so generous, so above and beyond anywhere else, Sophie simply couldn't turn it down. Before she'd had time to think about what it would mean, all this pastoralia, etc., she had enrolled. Now she found herself checking off days in the calendar, awaiting her parole. And yes, she knew she was being hyperbolic and dramatic, and it was a free 50 grand a year education and she should be grateful. But no matter how many times she told herself that, it didn't erase how unhappy she was. "I believe in the value of a liberal arts education," Sophie said now. It was her standard response to the annoying question she'd grown accustomed to, along with iceberg lettuce in the salad bar and cheese served on top of things that wouldn't seem worthy of dairy. Russell laughed. "I meant here, at the Ned Flandersist Christmas caroling concert of all time." There was something about the way he said it, as if he and Sophie were on the same side. It loosened something in her. "I'm doing anthropological research," she said. An ethnography of sorts?" "Yeah," Sophie said. "I'm particularly interested in the sweaters, the symbolism of the light-up ones." Sophie paused a beat, waiting for the blank expression and the "really?" she would have gotten off a Kyle or a Connor. To which Sophie would have to say, "No, not really, just kidding," and the conversation would have fizzled. But Russell was nodding along, stroking his chin in exaggerated professorial motions. "I believe those represent a mating ritual." "A mating ritual?" "Yes, you see, the male lights up in order to attract the attention of the female, so that procreation may ensue." "Like fireflies?" Sophie asked. "And anglerfish," Russell said. "Here's a question. Are the sweaters mating, or the people in them?" Sophie asked. When Russell grinned, he no longer looked professorial. "Couldn't tell you, Sophie," he said, "but both prospects scare the shit out of me." Sophie laughed. Not fake laughed or polite laughed, but her real laugh, with the almost snort at the end. It had been a while. "You wouldn't find it so funny if you knew the rest of the ritual," Russell warned, a hand over his mouth, all conspiratorial. "I'm almost afraid to ask." Sophie tilted her head up to listen. She was flirting a bit, something else she hadn't done in a while. "Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer is like a trigger. As soon as they hear it, all those sweaters," he shakes his head. "Trust me, you don't want to see it." "What, is it like a sweater orgy?" "Think about it. The lighting up of Rudolph's nose, all red and pulsating. It's a symbol for—" "I get it," Sophie interrupted, waving away the image, but she was still laughing. "You put a lot of thought into this. Scary, ain't it?" Sophie wasn't sure if he was referring to the amount of thought he'd put into it, or the vision of all these nice, clean, singing people having an orgy. But when, a few moments later, the carolers chimed in with the opening notes and words, "Rudolph the red-nosed reindeer had a very shiny nose," Sophie and Russell looked at each other, and as if by some mutual agreement, took off running. Again, folks, the book that the story is from is a collection of holiday stories called My True Love Gave to Me, and it is available at the North High Library. For print copies, you'll want to get online on the library's website and schedule a time to pick up your book using the form on the homepage. If you'd like an electronic or audio version, you'll want to use the Sora app or visit soraapp.com. Make it a great weekend or not, Saxons. The choice is yours.